Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Joan Wu. I'm the board member of Dallas Chinese Community Center. I'd like to take a moment to thank the City of Dallas to co-host this important and timely event on addressing hate crimes against Asians. And I also wanted to shout out to our sponsor, Orchid Giving Circle, so we can make this happen. Before we start, I want to have some housekeeping notes for you guys. Today, we will be talking about sensitive issues, so please be respectful for. Also, you're all invited to submit your question using chat box. So please feel free to do so throughout the program. And if you could put a Q in front of your question, that would be very helpful. And we have auto transcription available for those who need it. You can see there's a live script on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click on that and choose enable subtitle, and then you can see the transcription. Also, this event will be recorded and be shared after the discussion. Okay, now, so anti-hate crimes have increased 169% only during the first quarter. These are only ones that have been reported, so we're assuming there are more. And May is our Asian Heritage Month. So we wanted to help our Asian community to cope with this dynamic change. Therefore, we host this panel discussion in hope of bringing the awareness of what have happened in the past and present, also providing an opportunity for all of us to learn about hate crimes and hate incidents, also how to live and protect ourselves. Today, we will be hearing from three distinguished panelists, and Christina Da Silva, Jack Fan, and Senior Corporate Nam. I will introduce them to you guys later. And we also have Crystal and Daisy, who will be helping throughout this program for all your logistic needs. By the way, you're all invited to submit your question using the chat box. So please feel free to do that throughout this program. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program to our first panelist, Christina Da Silva. She's from Welcoming Community and Immigrant Affairs Officer. She will be addressing on hate crimes against Asians and some brief history behind that. Christina, welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Joan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Da Silva, and I'm the Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs Officer for the City of Dallas. I'm joined here with my colleagues, Senior Corporal Nam, and also the Asian American City of Dallas Employee Association and the Dallas Public Library, who have been helping also behind the scenes. I would also like to give a great big thanks to the Dallas Chinese Community Center for working with the City of Dallas to host this very important forum to address hate, racism, and xenophobia against our Asian community members. Next slide. In the months since the COVID-19 pandemic began, thousands of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have become targets of harassment and assault. These attacks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not isolated events. In fact, there have been historic systemic racism and xenophobia against Asian Americans and Pacific Islander community from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Japanese internment during World War II. I will briefly present on the historic and systemic racism against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in my presentation. This will be a very brief and general presentation and is not inclusive of all the systemic racism that has occurred, but it's just enough to give us a general understanding. Next slide, please. At the end of the 18th century, anti-Chinese sentiment was documented and began to grow. The term yellow peril was used to refer to the xenophobia and racism against Chinese communities in the US. This term also grew to include Japanese and Korean and Indian communities. This fear and racism and xenophobia that that was issued, especially publicized in media, narratives used by political leaders, fueled many anti-Asian policies, including the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the Cable Act that officially denied citizenship rights for many Asian Americans. It is important to note that this sentiment always excluded Asians, reducing them to be foreign and never American. Next slide, please. It was during this time of rampant racism, xenophobia, that we know that the first person of Chinese descent decided to choose Dallas as their new home. This person's name was J.L. Chow. He was an entrepreneur and opened the Chow Chow Laundry in 1874. We also know that there were other Chinese residents that moved to Dallas during the construction of the Houston, Texas Central Railway, which was actually going to become one of the most important railways for commercial purposes. Many Chinese workers were treated poorly and were not paid according to their contracts. It is documented that in July 1870, Chinese American workers began to protest, suing the Houston and Texas Railroad Company. This protest was actually one of the first among many fair labor efforts by Chinese workers throughout the South. So it's something that I think is very historically important to recognize, that Chinese American residents started their push towards fair treatment here in the Dallas area. Next slide, please. We also know that the Chinese community also experienced exclusion in education. The San Francisco Public Library actually had policies that segregated Chinese children starting in 1859. This actually continued until 1871. And while it wasn't in practice, the act wasn't officially repealed until 2017, more than 100 years after the controversies that resulted from this effort. So as you can see, we're still working to recognize and acknowledge our racist policies in the past. Next slide, please. The Immigration Act of 1917 was built on previous exclusionary policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This expanded the exclusion, basically. It raised the taxes on adult immigrants. It introduced a literary test for immigrants over the age of 16. It also expanded this list of undesirables, who included individuals who were considered quote unquote political radicals, or people with health conditions like epilepsy or mental health conditions. It actually also had policy that essentially barred all immigrants, regardless of how much money they were earned or their skill level. They barred all immigrants from the Middle East to Southeast Asia from entering the US. So again, just sort of kind of summarizing again, we've had this buildup of anti-Asian sentiment that has now become officially policy, and was policy for several decades. Next slide, please. On December 7th, 1941, just hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the FBI rounded 1,291 Japanese American community and religious leaders, arresting them without evidence or without cause, and freezing their assets. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered more than 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. And through those 3 years, from 1942 to 1945, it was the policy of the US government that people of Japanese descent, including US citizens, would be incarcerated and isolated in these camps. Next slide, please. So while after World War II ended, there was an attempt to shift the narrative. And this narrative was naming the Asian American Pacific Islander community as sort of a model minority. This new view was pushed heavily through media and political leaders. This portrait, however, is still harmful. Not only did it sort of glaze over the real problems that Asian communities experienced, especially when it came to still continued exclusion, still extreme poverty and harassment and abuse. But it also drove, the goal of it really was to drive a wedge between communities of color, particularly during the Civil Rights Movement. Next slide, please. One critical event that occurred was the murder of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American who was beaten to death by 2 white American men just a few days before his wedding. The reports of the attack actually had a lot of eyewitnesses, and the eyewitnesses all were able to confirm that the white men that were attacking him particularly because they were just recently laid off from their auto industry jobs. And so they were blaming him for losing their jobs. The murderers were actually only received, they were charged with manslaughter, which is, not a high level murder charge. And they were only given 3 years of probation. It was actually a big discussion around legal entities and even the judge, who said that this wasn't a racist crime, even though there were several reports that the reason why Vincent Chin was attacked was because of his Chinese descent. Vincent Chin actually became a martyr for many Asian American groups. His murder actually became sort of an event that helped bring groups together to help advocate and help recognize that Asian American and Pacific Islander communities also needed recognition in the civil rights movement. Next slide, please. We actually see that Japanese American activists such as the late Yuri Kochiyama worked in solidarity with other community of colors to advance civil rights movement. It was in fact the work that she did along with her husband, Bill, to work towards pushing for reparations and a formal apology for Japanese internees. It was then in 1988, thanks to all of their advocacy and mobilization, that the Civil Liberties Act was signed into law. And this act actually recognizes that the Japanese Internment Act should not have happened, and also paid, I think, approximately $20,000 for each individual who was held in the Japanese internment camp or their descendants. Next slide, please. We see once again our history repeat itself. So after the 9/11 attacks, there was a rise again of anti-Asian, anti-Muslim sentiments. Many individuals who were Muslim or Muslim appearing were attacked. There are several documentations, including the here in Texas, Vasudev Patel and Waqar Hassan, two South Asians who were attacked, killed in Texas. We also see once again that fear being a predecessor to real policies, particularly when the Supreme Court decision regarding the Muslim ban was upheld. Next slide, please. So these recent attacks have been reported, particularly thanks to grassroots organizations that have been working to not only build trust with Asian American communities, but also working to document. And since March 19th, 2020, Stop AAPI Hate has collected 6,603 incident reports. Majority of these incidents have had women as victims. They also include youth and individuals who are elderly. So it's definitely something that we've seen increase. Next slide. And while we've seen these incidents occur and increase since the start of the pandemic, we also want to recognize that this is not something new. This is definitely something that we have been slow to recognize even. Just even, in 2018, the Supreme Court had to officially appeal its ruling that allowed the Japanese internment camp to occur in the first place. And even just in 2011, the US Senate formally apologized the Chinese Exclusion Act. So as you can see, some of this effort to just recognize and repair have only just started. So I think that's why it's so important for us to be cognizant of our history, particularly when it comes to the hurt that we've caused against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think that, again, just more than ever, it's important that we become educated of the history of our systemic racism. If we don't know about it, how are we going to stop it? So that's, I think, one of the first steps into coming to terms with our history before we can take long-term action against racism. And next slide. Okay, now I'd like to hand the microphone over to my colleague, attorney Jack Fan. Sorry, to Joan. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the rich history. I sure learned a lot, and honest, I'm still quite shocked by all those separation and injustice happened before. And I just hope that we're not going backwards. So on behalf of our audience, I wanted to ask you a question first. Since those things has already happened for so long, and how do we deal with this institutional and systematic racism in this modern world? Any useful tips?
Well, I think I know it's valuable, as I mentioned, to learn our history and to find it. And I think it was interesting just even going through the process of researching for this presentation. There is a lot of information out there that even I didn't learn in school. And maybe that's on purpose, that I didn't get a chance to learn this history in school. But myself, as an ally, I think it was important for me to learn the history and to understand the historic racism. So that, I think, on an individual level, we have an opportunity to always push ourselves to learn, to understand, and to also be able to share that information with others. So that's on an individual level. But then on a systemic level, which is really what the core of your question is, that's where I think we all can take a role in pushing our leaders, our elected leaders, even city government. I'm hoping you all keep us, the city of Dallas, accountable. I will share that we recently passed a new municipal policy. At the end of March, we passed the city council passed unanimously the racial equity plan. And so that focus of the plan will be to look at how the city of Dallas can become a more equitable city, remove barriers that and undue burdens that communities of color experience. And that's where I'm sure there will be a lot of opportunities for the community to engage. And then also, just as a small little thing is, of course, anytime that you have a chance to participate with your local government or even state or federal, to please engage, share concerns. I think that even if you have the chance to vote, I think all of these things, of course, building our individual consciousness, holding our elected leaders accountable, and participating when we can in civic engagement processes, I think all of those bring us closer to ending systemic racism.
Yeah, so I love that you mentioned about like raising our consciousness and then hold accountable for anyone who should be involved and be more engaged in all those around us. Yeah, I think we can start from ourselves, like learning the history, knowing what has happened, and just be aware of what we're doing. And yeah, hopefully we can head into the right direction and take baby steps. And thank you so much, Christina.
Thank
So
you for this
now,
opportunity.
yeah, sure. So now let's move on to our next panelist, Jack Fan. So he is a board member and Dallas Asian American Bar Association, an attorney as well. So he will explaining the definition of hate crime, abuse, harassment, and learning your rights in the US. So Jack, welcome. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Joan, for inviting us. We, as members of the local bar association, play a very pivotal role in the context of this situation because we are often involved in criminal matters as well as civil matters. And so I'd like to first thank Christina for helping us understand what we're experiencing today collectively in the context of the history that our forebears have experienced. What I want to talk about today really is this idea of hate in the context of what is it to be considered a hate crime? When do individual actions cross the line from individual freedoms and opinions into something more sinister? So if we can go to the next slide, one of the things that I'd like to start off with is how many times have we heard people just say, well, this is a free country. I can do whatever I want. And that this idea that we live in this free country, that we have the freedom of expression, allows us this carte blanche power to simply do anything that we desire. And that's not necessarily the case, because with this false sense of entitlement, people can tease others, people can insult others, people can exclude others. And whether those actions are legal or not is a very different question in the context of whether or not it violates a criminal law or violates maybe a civil regulation. And so let's talk about a few examples. If we're good to go to the next slide. When we think of hate crime as a whole, what we tend to think about is your most traditional notions. A fight breaks out at a bar. Somebody is offended, they yell at each other, they're throwing out racial epithets, and then one person is starting to punch another person because they believe they lost their jobs because of XYZ reasons. Again, this is the Vincent Chan context. This is what we typically anticipate and think of when we think of the idea of hate crimes. Something that is overtly racist, something where during the act of the crime itself, people are yelling and throwing out racial slurs. Again, this is an obvious example, but let's look at the second example. If we can go to the next slide. What if a woman takes a gun to a men's locker room? She fires numerous shots, killing two of the men who both happen to be Asian, yet a third person was also shot and injured. This third person was not of Asian descent. What then? Is that act by itself a hate crime? Well, what if it was later then discovered that she had this blog that she hated Asian noodles because it made her addicted to food? does her hatred of Asian noodles constitute a hate crime? And so this example may be a little bit more familiar because this was the Atlanta shooting. In the act of the actual shooting itself, an individual walks into several establishments. They all happen to be Asian owned, and he starts killing people. That by itself isn't necessarily a hate crime. We don't know necessarily in the context of the act itself. But only later, when we reveal the person's thinkings, the person's personal thoughts, diaries, journals, online entries, blogs, we realize that the motivation was somehow more connected. And even if we go further back, if you think about the El Paso shooting, again, an individual goes in to a Walmart and starts shooting individuals. Is the act of violence itself a hate crime? We don't know at that very moment. It was only after we discovered the shooter's blogs on Reddit, on 4chan, that we realized that the motivation was racially based. And so let's understand this context of what a hate crime really means. Our next slide, if we can. So you see, the reality is that there's not really a crime specifically known as a hate crime. When we look at the Texas statutes, when we look at local laws, there's nothing imminently in big, bold letters that says hate crime. Rather, hate crime is really a collection of procedures, of things that the law enforcement has to do. So for instance, when we look at the Texas Hate Crime Act and we look at the Texas Government Code, what it really simply says is it's the government's responsibility to collect information that may be motivated by prejudice, hatred. And again, it's not necessarily confined to simply racial prejudice. It could be gender prejudice. It could be prejudice against the LGBTQ community. And so it's a greater context that the first thing that the government's responsible is doing is to collect information. But beyond that, hate crime is really going through the criminal procedure where, again, if the underlying crime could be enhanced by the person having caused it in some degree of intentionality because of bias or prejudice, then there's an enhancement statute. So what could have been a Class B misdemeanor could be elevated to a Class A misdemeanor. And what that means is that the fines, the penalties, the length in jail get increased. But again, by itself, it's not a hate crime in the context of what we think of it, where there's a specific statute saying, if you do this, then it's called a hate crime. And so let's go to our next slide, where we have to really understand that all crime in many ways has to look at the underlying nature. So then we look at the Texas Penal Code, which basically finds that if there's an affirmative finding of violence, again, this is where we get that enhancement statute. So what crimes should we really be thinking about in some degrees? Because how do we know a crime is a hate crime when it's being perpetrated when we don't know it's actually racially motivated or prejudiced? So to understand what crimes may be entitled to this enhancement, we really need to take a step back. And so let's go to our next slide in terms of understanding that these may be crimes against ourselves as a person or even against property. And in this context, you may start recognizing that you may have already been a victim of hate crime before. So when we talk about persons, we're looking at really intense and really horrid ideas. Homicide, that's murder, kidnapping, trafficking, unlawful restraint. But it could even go into something that's a little bit more milder in some degrees. Because again, when we're looking at assault, even being hit by somebody, even unwanted touches, even terroristic threats, all of these contacts and conducts may arise to becoming a hate crime because the underlying nature of the offense itself is a criminal matter. And we're just thinking about if we get hurt ourselves, what if it's something that we own? What if our store gets burnt down? That's arson. What if our store gets painted with racial epithets? Again, that's graffiti. Crime against property can also be elevated to hate crimes as well. And so when we have this understanding and this realization, that hate crime is actually larger and more encompassing than what we typically associated with, then we understand that we may have more tools at our individual disposal than we realize. And so, for instance, let's go to our next slide to understand specifically as an idea. So actually, we're going to jump ahead, but I'm going to talk about the federal side. I apologize. Now, there is also federal law and there's also state law. And the real distinction between federal and state is often simply who prosecutes, whether it's a local district attorney or is it on the federal side, the assistant attorney general. And because of federal prosecution, there is more resources that are available. And so when we think about the El Paso shooting, a crime of this nature, when at least 23 individuals had died, well, on one hand, we could go to the local county and ask the district attorney, or maybe this is so severe that the federal government will step in. And so recently, as of April 22nd, the Senate did pass an enhanced anti-Asian hate crime bill. But that by itself did not actually create any new criminal causes of actions or any criminal statutes that would allow a prosecutor to prosecute individuals for crimes. Instead, what the Senate actually did was simply pass by 94-1 that we will add additional funding. We will provide more resources, more grants to local and state law enforcement agencies to help collect this information. As Christina said, prior to even this year, a lot of this information about racially motivated attacks against Asians was simply not reported. No one really kept track of it. And so it was only really until some organization, a nonprofit group, a dedicated group of Asian individuals realized we need to start collecting this information and giving a process for individuals to report this information. That's how we even knew there were at least 6,603 attacks within a year. And so again, the funding does allow for more of this report to provide. The other thing that the Senate did, and that's really been helpful, is provide a national guidance. Because again, if you think about California law, Texas law, Louisiana law, every state has a different definition. So they're all operating very differently. What may be more penalized in one jurisdiction may not be so in another state. And so having some degree of a national guidance allows a streamline or at least some cohesion between the different jurisdictions. So when we go to the next slide, let's go back and talk a little bit more about, well, what are some of the other crimes that we may be even experiencing that we may not really think about? Because I think that one of the important things that we have to realize is that there is a distinction between bias and hate incidents as opposed to hate crimes, because not every action is necessarily a criminal action. Someone may express to me prejudice. Someone may yell at me for calling me names, but by just name calling me by itself is not necessarily a crime, because the crime has to have in some degree some connection with an injury to the person or some sort of damage to personal property. So we need to think beyond simply bias. We need to think beyond simply words. But as I've said, words can't cross the line. And so that's what really, now I promise, I think our next slide is going to talk about that. Terroristic threats as a really good example. If there's an individual that places another person and gives them the fear of imminent serious bodily injury, or even if they prevent someone from occupying a space, for instance, if you think of maybe white nationalists gathering around a synagogue or even a mosque, and they prevent people from entering that mosque, that type of conduct could rise to the level of a terroristic threat. No one was immediately harmed, but the fear of being harmed itself could rise to the level of being a terroristic threat. And next slide. What about even harassment? A continuous series of insults that suddenly arises to a different level of conduct. If we go to the next slide. Each individual insult by itself may be relatively innocuous. It may be hurtful. It may be harmful. But if it's systemic, if there's a pattern that we're trying to harass, annoy, alarm, abuse, again, insults in this nature may sufficiently arise to the level of criminal activity. And that's a version of harassment. And so again, you don't have to be physically harmed for there to be a hate crime. So long as there is an underlying criminal action that we can tether, that by itself can create this idea that this conduct is so egregious, now it becomes a hate crime. Our next slide, please. So at the end of the day, what do we need to do? What do you need to keep in mind? Well, first and foremost, always seek help in the sense that if you feel threatened, if you feel endangered, ask, whether contacting the local police, whether calling 311, whether calling the local community church member or civic leader. Let people know that something has happened. Because the problem is, if we don't know these instances are occurring, then there's not an ability for some other organization to respond. And I'll give you a really good case in point. Within even our local bar association, when we think of crimes against Asian Americans, we're not thinking of Dallas, Texas. We're thinking of possibly New York and California. But to our surprise, Texas is actually number 3. Now, maybe it's because they're experiencing more issues in Houston than we are in Dallas. But the reality is, unless we, the local community, know that these instances are occurring, local leaders may not be able to respond appropriately. So seek help. Speak up. Number 2, oftentimes the simple act of voicing your rights, of announcing that you are offended, that will allow other people to recognize that what they're doing may be harmful or offensive. Most people don't see themselves as being racist. In fact, I believe that's about 99% of everyone. We don't think of ourselves as racist, but we may also not recognize we are exhibiting racist intentions or thoughts. So speaking up to someone, to your aggressor, to your offender, that may be enough for them to recognize that, oh my gosh, this is something that is grossly wrong. And lastly, collecting evidence. I think one of the most startling differences between what happened with Vincent Chen and what is happening today, even with George Floyd, is the prevalence of social media as well as smartphones. Imagine when Vincent Chen was being attacked, if people had video footage, as opposed to simply testimony from oral individuals, from oral testimony. We can see and look and hear with our own eyes after the fact. So much of the injustices that we're now recognizing today is because we have video recordings, whether it's streamed or recorded. So again, let me remind you the 3 things that you can do that's very easy. Seek help, speak up, and collect evidence. Because unfortunately, we're in a situation where law enforcement may not be able to have all the information at their disposal, and we'll need to help provide this information to them. Because if a crime is occurring at the time, there's no one else to record but you. And let's go to our final slide. Actually, our next slide and then final slide. So a lot of people may be concerned in a sense about recording. Again, do it from a safe distance, as again, as Senior Corporal Nam will talk about a little bit more, because the point is you are your own advocate. Texas is a one-party consent law state. There's a one-party consent state, which means so long as one person in an interaction agrees to be recorded, that's perfectly fine. That by itself may be a very scary thought, but it is also very good defense. If you're in an environment, in a public place, take out your smartphone, either start video recording if you feel safe, and if you don't, just record it in your pocket. Audio is just as good. You are your own advocate in these cases. And so let me conclude by saying that I'm a member of the Dallas Asian American Bar Association. We are an organization of local attorneys. We are here to help. And if you go to our next slide and our final slide, you'll have our website as well as a membership directory. If you need assistance, whether you need someone just to talk to or ask for guidance, please reach out to our organization. We are, in some degrees, your first line of defense. With that, I turn it back to Joan.
Thank you, Jack. I think it's interesting to learn that hate crime itself is not a separate category of offense and is simply an enhanced punishment. That's very interesting. And I'm glad to know that Texas is the one-party consent law. So, yeah. So I wanted to ask you a question. I've been hearing a lot from my friend that for immigrants from older generations, their need for security and safe sometimes outweigh the need to speak out. So they kind of need to stay detached and even like stay under the radar to speak up and for the need to stay away from threat to their children or even the way of their living. So how do we shift or help them for this kind of mentality and even we can say fear inside to adapt to this new world?
I think it's important that we remember that as immigrants, we are in many ways a conformist culture. The first immigrants who arrived from China, from Vietnam, from Asia, we wanted simply to adapt. We didn't want to cause a ruckus. Didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. And that's in some degrees how they thrived, is basically by being unnoticed. And so this idea of being non-confrontational is how, you're right, that's how we survived. And that may still continue to a lot of people in terms of their mentality, and that's perfectly fine. I think what it really needs is to be aware and to be and to be an advocate separately. Again, you don't have to be confrontational to advocate for your own rights. When something happens, report it after the fact. Let the police, let other generations who are able in a position to take that in-person advocacy to the problem instead. And so I guess what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is you can be your own advocate without directly speaking up. Let others speak up for you, but you have to let people know what's going on. And I'll use as a really good example. We recently at the bar received a complaint or a concern about an individual living in an apartment building. And they had simply said, look, I feel threatened. I'm seeing beer cans around in my front doorsteps. And in some degrees, beer cans, that's just litter. But is the beer can symbolic of something maybe even potentially greater? Is it something left to intimidate? And so only by knowing that these things are happening can we start really noticing trends. And so again, non-confrontational, doesn't have to do much, just letting someone else be aware or know, hey, I think something might be happening and I feel threatened.
Wow, I think that's a very interesting perspective. Like, you don't need to feel you need to confront with anyone, but just stating the truth and let others to advocate for you. I think that's a very good approach for all of us. And even us, sometimes we will be kind of worried if we stand out for people. I will definitely learn that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now let's move on to our next panelist, Senior Corporal Nang from Dallas Police Department, Office of Community Affairs. He will be addressing on resources on how to promote safety, prevention, and reporting. Senior Corporal Nang, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Joan. First of all, this is Senior Corporal Sunam from the Dallas Police Department, Office of Community Affairs. I am part of the Asian Community Outreach Unit, and I want to first thank the Dallas Chinese Community Center, Joan, Crystal, and Lisa Chung Annert for inviting me. And it's a great time to spend to give information to our community. So going back quickly to what Jack was saying, especially if you are recording an incident, especially in a maybe possibly violent crime, just be aware of your surroundings when you do that, and just know that you may get into harm's way. If in the situation that happens, you might be a victim of a crime. So just be mindful of your surroundings before you decide to record that. So here are some of the reporting incidents that's on the topic. If you are a victim of a crime, it's important, call 911. A lot of times when you do call 911, a lot of times people don't give enough information, or if their information is not enough to where we can make basically a hate crime. We also added some couple of information, the FBI Dallas field office, The Stop the API, those are the three organization that was started because once once COVID started, people started being committed at home. They weren't being able to get out, and at some point the rhetoric was about the anti-Asian sentiment was coming out, and so because of that, these organizations started and started putting the numbers. Next slide. Okay. Again, first topic we're going to go is of the personal safety program. Next slide. So the purpose of our personal safety program is to increase our personal safety awareness, provide a defense strategy to prevent victimization, provide crime prevention pointers to avoid assault, and to improve police and community relations. Next slide. So who is an attacker looking for? Next. They are looking for women, elderly, children, distracted, people that are alone, that are people unlikely to put up a fight, or people that are carrying large amount of cash. I'll tell you about a lot of stories that have been recently happening, especially with the elderly women. If you don't know, a couple months ago in San Francisco, there was a Asian woman that was walking at the streets of Oakland, and there's a white male that came out behind and just sucker punched her. Okay, she ended up with a bruise to her eye, and so she was able to get back at the guy. He hit him with the stick, and he ended up going to the hospital. But just be aware, because I know she was walking down the street, and because we need to know where we are, and sometimes we forget that because whether it's the just the surroundings, the situation, if that's the way we've done, just be mindful of that. Again, children, especially these days, if they walk to school, just be mindful. Have a talk with your children about not talking with strangers, because a lot of times there are suspicious people out there in the streets. They do watch what people do, and if you need to take your children to school, do that. Or if you need to take them to the bus stop and make sure they get on the bus, please do so. And a lot of times we can prevent from being a victim and just by looking at smartphones. And I'll let you know, I'm part of to blame as well. We are busy walking down the street, looking at the smartphones or on the phone. When we drive, we don't pay attention because we're distracted, and that's what the suspicious, the bad people are looking at. And if you're walking alone, especially at night, just be mindful. Go out in a group, because they will look. Because they will make a plan, and they will see what you're doing, and they will take that time and go out, and all of a sudden they run, grab your wallet, or grab your little purse, and they're already gone. And again, if you're going to carry large amounts of cash, especially going to a bank, just find us a place where you can, like a closet or somewhere there's no window where people are able to see. A lot of times suspicious people, they walk through the neighborhood, they tend to try to open the doors or look through the windows to see what they're doing. So just be mindful of that. Next slide. What opportunities are they looking for? Next. Again, the attackers are watching for a stranded motorist, a broken window, a dark parking lot, dangling purse, an unlocked door, and visible packages in your vehicle. And I've added the stranded motorist is because it's very important. Again, if you need to keep your cars updated, because if you do get lost and if your car breaks down somewhere, maybe in a shady area, and you're calling for help, it can take some time. And so just be aware of that. People, they don't care. Bad people don't care where you are, what you're doing, what happened to your car. And you're just, you're trying to do a good thing. But again, so just be aware of that. A broken window, same thing. Fix the window. Otherwise, Again, if you don't fix your window, you just put a little plastic bag over it. Again, it's going to be easy for those suspicious people, bad people, to just go through the car, and you might have left your belongings, some kind of important belongings. They could grab that. A dangling purse, again, please do not carry it like that. It's loosely like that. They see that, and so they take that opportunity. They run, they pull, they grab, they're gone. Just be mindful of that. An unlocked door. You may be going to a 7-Eleven for a second. You just leave the door open, left, for a second, grab it, but then it takes only a couple seconds for them to get in and steal a vehicle. So just be aware of that. Visible packages in your vehicle. So we remind our citizens, lock, take, and hide. Again, when you're going somewhere, make sure you lock your vehicle, take your important belongings, and if you carry something expensive, hide them so they won't be attracted to it. Again, people, they go around neighborhoods, they try opening the door. Some door may be unlocked, they go through it. Otherwise, these suspects, people are a lot more smarter these days. They can actually use the little the window opener to unlock the door to older cars, and they can get in. So just be mindful of that. Next slide. What should you do to prevent from being attacked? Next. Be alert. This is the most important thing. I always tell people this: know your surroundings, use your eye contacts, observe the people around you. So take your time. Just if you're about to go somewhere, maybe grocery shopping, just make a plan. Write down what you're going to go purchase, and don't carry, just don't carry too many credit cards with you. Just take enough cash with you so you can know what to buy. And when you get out for just a second, just scan the area around the neighborhood. Because you do that, you have a good possibility you can observe something suspicious. And if you observe something suspicious, then you can definitely call 911 and get police out. Know where you are going. Make sure you do know where you're going. If you don't know where you're going, before you leave, go on your phone, Google your map, make sure to map it, and then that'll help you to get to where you're going. Use your sixth sense. If something feels wrong or out of place, it probably is, and have a plan. Again, suspects also have a plan. They are a lot more smarter these days. You should too. If you were attacked, what would you do? Have you actually thought about it? Or would you fight, freeze up, or run away? Next. So have an escape plan. Again, in strange or unfamiliar places, make it a habit to make a mental note of your surroundings. Identify all avenues of escape and look for people who can help you if you are attacked. Especially if you're in a big area, let's say a mall. You're going to a mall shopping with friends or family. Look for doors, emergency exit, if you're elevators, windows, stairway, any opportunity to get away. Because, have you seen there have been some big shootings here and there, and you never know what you're going to run into. So just be aware of your, again, surroundings. Look for potential escape routes. Practice finding an escape at your home. If you're at an office, a friend's house, or the neighbor's house, you can just imagine it in your head. Just practice. Where would you go if something happened? And don't panic. Have a plan and put it into action. And don't freeze up. Use your rush of your adrenaline to give you the strength to get away. Now, what to do if you're attacked? Now, if you cannot distract the attacker, let's say if you're in between you and him, there's a shopping cart in the way, maybe you can push him, get away to a building somewhere to get some help. Now, also be realistic about your ability to protect yourself. Again, if you are dealing with somebody in a situation, in a knife fight, you're not going to beat somebody with a knife, okay? Just give up the property and let him take it, call 911 and make a report. It's better to, again, like we say, you can replace products, but you cannot replace a life. Just be aware of that. Report all crimes and call 911. Next. Okay, we're going to briefly talk about 911 system. Next. So when you become a victim, when you call 911, make sure you know your address or phone number. Now, sometimes, yeah, you might not know the address, but if you're able to describe a building, let's say you're at a street across, there's a gas station, you're in between a gas station and a supermarket. If you see a supermarket, you should see a block number. So just let them know. Now, when you talk, stay calm, speak slowly and clearly. The issue with communication between the dispatcher and our complainant is because they talk fast. Sometimes the information are not clear and bad information is given as a result. Now, if you speak different languages, they have the language line. This is for the city of Dallas. We have up to 240 languages provided, and it actually takes 15 to 30 seconds to connect. It may take a few minutes. It may take a minute or two, maybe slower than speaking English, but they will get that done for you. And so when you call, what type of emergency, who needs help, if it's a medical emergency, if it's a person awake and breathing, and the most important thing is to not hang up until the dispatcher says it's okay to hang up. Right? Next. Okay, the 911 call response time. Now, actual response times may be affected by staffing at the substation or a police station, the location of the officer at the time of the dispatch, traffic and weather conditions, insufficient or incorrect information from the caller, or the language barrier, communication with the language line. And this is very important. So why you need to speak clearly and slowly, because as the language sometimes we may mistaken for one word for another word. So you may, if you give a 9780 Walnut Street, but the dispatch and you say too fast, sometimes they might miss a number or a letter. They might get it as 97.8 Walnut, and that is a huge difference. The officers, if they get the information, it's going to take some time for them to find the correct address. So that's one way that's going to take some time. Again, another time it could be the call, depending on the call. If it's like a loud music, it might take some time. But if the life is on the line, yeah, that might cause us to come a lot more quick. Next slide. So we in the city of Dallas and the police department, we go by call priority. So priority 1, 2, 3, and 4. Priority 1 is emergency. It's basically if there's shooting call, stabbing, felony in progress, something violent. Priority 2 is like urgent. We still go there quickly, but we don't go lights and sirens. If it's the robbery, it just finished robbery. Now, if it's a robbery in progress that's currently happening, that's actually a lights and siren priority 1. But if it's after the fact, it's going to be a priority 2. If it's a disturbance, argument, general argument, it's going to be a priority 2. We're still going to respond quickly, but it will be a little bit lesser than emergency call. General priority 3 is if the car break-in already happened and they already left, it's a report call. Priority 4, non-critical, it's loud music, general thing like that. It's going to be take some time. Now, racing is actually now a priority 2 because it's been an issue. So I should that thing should be updated, but that is a priority 2 call. Next slide. Okay, this is a very important, especially when you call a 911 system, especially if you become a victim, whether it's going to be hate crime or robbery. If you can describe your attacker, it'll be the more information you give, the more opportunity that officers can send out the message to the other police officers, and there's a good chance we may be able to catch them. Now, a lot of the times, if they're already gone, they're already gone. But if you have more information, the more better. Car license in here, if there's a car, you'll be able to provide the car license number, race of the assailant, approximate age, weight and height, hair color and length of hair, color of eyes, clothing, if they have any type of ring, direction of travel, and if they had a weapon, if you say if you had a black semi-automatic weapon, and then if you're able to see them in person, if they flee on foot, try to get their hair, eyeglasses, if they had marks, tattoos, mustache, shirt, tattoo, trousers, shoes. Try to get as much as possible if you can. Now, if it happens so fast, so you might not be able to get it, a lot of it, but if you're able to get good information, that would be helpful. Next. And that's it.
Thank you, Corporate Nam, for all those practical tips. I guess I will start to have an exit plan wherever I go, which I never thought I have to do that.
Yeah.
So there's one question I wanted to ask on behalf of our audience. So by the way, so for all the audience, you're all invited to submit your questions. So please feel free to do that. And the question is, what kind of equipment for self-defense purpose is it recommended to carry in our bag or also in our car?
Okay, so just be aware. A lot of times, people have been seen carrying a pepper spray. I've seen them use that as a defense. Again, the best defense is really just to be self-aware, be aware of your surroundings. If you are aware of your surroundings, you know what's going on. Because if you don't know what's going on around you, then even whatever equipment you carry, that's not going to help, because by the time it happens, it already happened. So just be aware of your surroundings, and you will know, you'll have that sixth sense. And then reporting is very important, because if you see something and you don't report it, and you might be able to go safely, now the next poor soul might end up becoming a victim of a crime. So just be aware of your surroundings. That's the best defense, I can tell.
I see. Yeah, so we all need to pay more attention to our surroundings, right? That's the first step. Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you for the wonderful information from those panelists. Now we have compiled a resource page for the audience. Now we can take a look at that. So from the resources page, we can see some statistic data and even training information and some safety tips. For example, if we click on the second one, the safety tips, then you will see some useful safety tips that can incorporate into your daily life. And we will be sending that through you guys through email in the end of the discussion. So now it's time for our Q&A. And let's see. I wanted to ask first question to Christina. And like historical systematic racism against Asian was hardly ever mentioned during the civil rights movement. So what do you think the reason is? Is that because we're less involved in political perhaps, or so moving forward, what should we do?
Well, I think that it's important I think there's a couple things with that question. Number one, I actually think Asian Americans were very involved in civil rights efforts. I wasn't able to include this in my presentation, but if you look at the longest student strike in American history, the San Francisco State strike that lasted 5 months between November 1968 and November 1968 and March 1969, featured Asian American groups as real power players in this strike. And that this strike was particularly focused on civil rights. So I think that unfortunately, there's this narrative that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders have not been involved or are not active in advocating for themselves. And I think that's incorrect. I think that people who work in this field of sharing history and also educating ourselves, we need to do a better job in also highlighting the contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I think that's a problem that we need more representation. We need more narratives and stories that really share the facts that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are and have been involved. So I think that also, if we look at even just having more opportunities for Asian American studies programs to be held in schools and universities. So I think that is an issue. I think that, to me, I say that's a systemic issue, that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are left out when we talk about the civil rights history. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but because I see it more as a job of allies and people who are involved with leading these systems, that we need to do a better job in making sure that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have that representation.
Mhm. So yeah, I think we need more representation stating that we're actually very active and try our best to do that. So hopefully in the long run, it can get better. So now we have another question. I wanted to direct this to Jack. So what is sufficient evidence to sue or take actions while we stop being mistreated by non-Asian American coworkers at workplace? I think this is a very specific question. So I guess the audience are facing some mistreated at workplace.
I think it's a two-part answer in some degrees, because you have criminal matters, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. And while no one really says what a reasonable doubt is, let's just call it 85%, for instance. Whereas in civil, it's preponderance of the evidence, which is 51%. And so your question is, what is required, or what type of evidence is helpful to get, whether it's to conviction or the judgment that you're looking for, will be very fact specific. And so maybe let's just talk real quickly in sense of what evidence could be. Evidence could be testimony. It could be oral evidence, meaning that you go to court, you raise your hand and you say, I promise that this is the truth, where you're opening yourself to cross-examination. But that really relies on your credibility. More commonly nowadays is electronic evidence, whether it's photographs of text messages, whether it's screenshots of social media accounts, whether it's emails. A lot of these things are just things that are kept on your phone. Videos, voice recordings, all of those are potentially helpful. Now, that being said, a lot of times clients will come to me and say, well, I've got all this evidence. And the reality is not all evidence is necessarily useful evidence. It may be things that we don't really want the other side to see, or the judge or the jury to really see. Not everything is all that valuable. But where this evidence may be really helpful is negotiations. Because if I have very incriminating information, whether it's for a civil matter or a criminal matter, that encourages the other side to negotiate a settlement. And so a lot of times what we do as attorneys is we help identify and really filter through what is important and what is not. And so my suggestion for everyone is, when you're in the very beginning of the case and you don't know what's relevant, just keep everything recorded or keep everything documented. At some point in time, the prosecutor will figure out, I'm going to use this, I'm going to use that. One of the things that we've not really talked about is just a pre-trial phase where lawyers get together and we just discuss, all right, I'm going to agree to this, I'm not going to agree to this, and these we're going to ask the judge to decide on. So the reality is evidence may not always get it to trial because you're really looking to figure out a way to settle before you even get to that phase.
Oh, okay. So there are some ways that we can collect things, but the matter is really how valuable those evidence really represent. Yeah, thank you. And I have another question. I would like to direct this one to Corporate Nam, and maybe Jack or Christina, if you have any thought to add on this, we would love to hear about that. So it's a little touchy, but the question from the audience is that he just saw some videos that the police officer was telling others that it's illegal to record when police officers are questioning them. So, and that will lead to a critical issue and might go to jail. So, is that true? And also, what should we do if we are happen to be in a situation that we feel we're harassed by police officer?
Okay, so when you are in a situation like that, you can request to get their identification, as for their badge numbers and their names. And in the city of Dallas, as in the Dallas Police Department, we are required to give you that information. Now, these days, all the police officers are now actually carrying body cameras as well. And so that encounter really, again, that shouldn't happen. But if you have issues, get that information. And the way you can do is in Dallas, you can go to downtown, at 1400 Botham Jean, between 8 and 5 p.m. And you can go to the second floor at the Internal Affairs Division, and you can actually file a complaint about that situation. And from there, they will have you sign a piece of paperwork, just fill out a form stating that this is the offense that occurred and this is what happened between the police officer. In the situation, they don't give you their ID and badge, just ask for a supervisor. They are also required to send you a supervisor, and you can talk to them as well. And also, I'll just once you are at the Internal Affairs Division or at the station making the complaint, they will, once you're done with the paperwork, they will file it and go, it's going to go the chain of command. And that's where they're going to start the paperwork. And then it's going to go up to the right corporate department. And we'll see if they will look at that incident. They will look at the body cameras. They will look at the camera, if you took that camera, just to look what's going on. And then ultimately, they will decide if it's sustained or if it's gonna, if the level of severity, it's just gonna depend on the encounter with the citizen and the police officer.
Oh, okay. So the badge number and names are really important.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But he was saying that he saw some videos saying that it's illegal to video record. But I remember Jack mentioned that Texas is one party consent. So where is the statement coming from that it's illegal to record when police officers are questioning us? Jack, do you want to jump in?
Sure, absolutely. I think that gets to a very different question when you're dealing with police investigations, because recording an officer may run afoul of a different law, which is interference with a police investigation, which is often what you typically see on television. And so you may be very cognizant of where you are. Again, if you're across the street and you're recording something that's interaction that's happening on the other side, then possibly that's safe. If you're getting in front of the police's face, that's a different matter altogether. So I would be cautious with that statement in terms of recording, especially if you're discussing police interactions, because again, that's a very different line than when we're discussing about hate crime. In the context of hate crime, recording an encounter is potentially a defense because nobody wants to be recorded. Police interactions, they're already considering a number of other factors that they may not have the bandwidth to worry about other people being videotaped. Again, I can't speak for that because it's technically outside of the scope of our conversation today. And there's so much more nuance that's really involved in recording police interactions. But if I also may, Joan, real quick, I wanted to respond to an individual who had mentioned possibly that text messages don't count as evidence in court. And that really depends on what you're using the text messages for, which is why I say record everything or document everything. Let the lawyers decide what will ultimately be used, because text messages can enter court as evidence for a number of reasons. Maybe not necessarily for the actual text itself, but the mere fact that it was sent, right? Again, it's not hearsay if you're not using for the actual words. And so again, allow the lawyers in your case to really help advise whether or not particular evidence would be admissible or not.
Okay, I see. So it's really a different, very sensitive situation. But I think we will all take corporate norm's suggestion that the page and page number and the name. So let me see. We have another question. Here's for maybe Christina. Are there resources to provide face-to-face counseling to deal with psychological impact after encountering hate crime?
Thank you for that question. I'm not, I know things with the pandemic, it may be kind of hard to find face-to-face resources, but I know that a lot of mental health resources are going virtual, just like as we're doing right now with this panel. You know, we have a Zoom account, and so we can talk as if we're in person, but just safely. I just put in, sent to Crystal to put in the chat 2 resources. One of them is NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Health. And they have North Texas resources. These include phone numbers that you can call. And they also include places that include no insurance, or maybe you might have the difficulty to pay. So that is one area where you can call and get connected with a counselor. The other one is the Mental Health Association of America. They provide some more details and information about statistics, especially when it comes to mental health issues in the Asian Pacific Islander community. There's also the Asian American Psychological Association that provides fact sheets, awareness, and other resources. I think also you might be able to find providers through the South Asian Therapists network that they have connected on that website. So we'll put that information in the chat so that you guys can have access to that. And we'll definitely follow up as all of you registered for this program. We'll also make sure you all have that information in your emails.
Yeah, thank you for the useful resources. And the information is on the chat box, so everyone can reference that. So there's another question. I wanted to direct this to Jack. Based on your presentation, hate crime is not a crime unless there are physical injuries or property loss. It sounds like a difficult situation for the victim to deal with. So what's your suggestion?
Well, my suggestion is to file a police report or to speak with another individual within the community, because the most obvious instances of hate crime often result because of bodily injury. Again, if you're hit, if you're hurt, if your property was damaged. What's not as obvious are those lesser crimes of harassment, of even just very minor assault. Again, if you were just pushed, but you were not bodily harmed, that by itself is a type of crime, but how would you even prove that even outside the context of a hate crime? And so what I recommend again is filing the police report. Nothing may potentially happen, but I think as Senior Corporal Nam will also attest, the more information that's out there, the more likely that police are going to be able to put the resources. Because again, if there's a collection of suddenly instances occurring in this particular neighborhood, and again, they're all really minor, but something larger may be happening, nobody knows about it unless it's reported.
Yeah, even if you get shoved, it's still a Class C assault. So still, again, it's because it's just a minor assault. Just still call and make a report. The more report you make, the information that we get. So I mean, if you don't report it, it's not going to be an offense. So just be aware of that. You make a report. If you were pushed and then the guy made a comment regarding about your race, it's still a hate crime. So just be mindful of that. Like Jack said, call the police, make a report.
Okay, so I guess this is related to our next question. So since harassment and threat are not crime unless they're body injuries or property damage, then so what's the point of reporting to the police?
Well, if I may, Joan, actually, harassment is a crime. It's a question of whether or not that crime could be prosecuted. Not everything that gets reported or is actually a crime will actually face criminal prosecution, because that's a responsibility of the district attorney's office. And it's within the district attorney's office's direct discretion whether or not they're going to pursue that particular prosecution based off of the evidence available. And so the question is, what is the point of reporting? Well, even reports have a lot of value on the civil side. If an incident occurred and you were to pursue civil enforcement, whether it's under the Fair Housing Act, whether it's under some other federal jurisdiction in terms of federal regulations, whether it's an OSHA complaint, whether it's an EEOC complaint, any number of things, a police report becomes the first incident that's written down and documented. And so you may use that police report in a variety of different contexts. Again, it's the starting point.
Anyone want to add on this? Yeah, I think Jack make a good point. It's a starting point, and those information can be used in a variety of ways for future reference or even just like education materials. So I think we need to speak up and be more presentation about our engagement to all those change. So yeah, we should try to report all incidents. Even
Well, Joan, if I may, there's a question that's asked, and I'd like to get Senior Corporal Nam maybe to help respond to that, because the question was asked, should we make a report if it's just a verbal attack? If you were being verbally assaulted or you were being insulted. And to a certain extent, again, that may be terroristic threats, that may be harassment. But Senior Corporal Nam, what happens if someone just calls and says, hey, I'm being harassed by someone? Should they make that report?
Yes, it's very important you make the report, because if you just ignore what they said, they're going to keep on whatever doing. They could send you text message all day long and you can ignore that, but they keep on doing it. And if you don't make a report, then it's just like not having make an offense made. So it's very important you make the report, and especially if it's a verbal threat that I know where you live, I'm going to head to your house and beat you up, and then use racial slurs. Yeah, please, that's an offense. Make the report. If you don't make a report, it's the same thing as not having an offense. And if you do make the report, and that report actually is reported, if it involves the hate crime, it involves the issues with that, it can be reported to the FBI as well. So that number, because if you don't report it, you don't know it as if it happens.
And so to add on that, I think that's what's really valuable in terms of understanding it is better to potentially over-report than it is to under-report in many regards. If you feel that you've been threatened, if you feel that your life was endangered, or you feel uncomfortable, filing a report doesn't really take much effort necessarily, and it may not be a giant ripple in this whole scheme of things, but it is the beginning of something. And there is documentation. Again, let's say this individual is a person who's been ultimately found to be known to harass a number of people, not just you. You personally would not know that this person's behavior has been a pattern, a systemic pattern. And so the police, when they review the information, especially when they know who it is, suddenly they're realizing, wait a minute, this individual could be potentially dangerous or a threat to the community. So that's why reporting is actually really valuable on the aggregate side.
Yeah, I think finding a pattern really matter. So Senior Corporal Nam, you wanted to say something?
Again, yeah, whatever it is, if it's a verbal threat, don't ignore it. Get that information. If they send you harassing text messages involved, even if it's you don't think it might be much, report that, because if you don't report that, then they're gonna keep on doing it. So report it. The more you report, the more we get that information, the more information we get, we're able to look and maybe connect it to some other, suspects or anything like that.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we have one question. I think this is probably for everybody. What can you recommend to help, like her or his school board, regarding including AAPI history for AAPI Heritage Month, or similar to Black History Month? Do you have any recommendation or resources that they can incorporate those information into their school? Anyone want to get that a go?
I think when it comes to school districts, obviously each school district has their own way of operating. But in general, I think it's helpful when you have the ability to talk with the leadership at your local school, and then identify what is the process for making a request. So for example, like with the city of Dallas, for us to issue a proclamation, there is a process. And so usually what happens is a resident sends an email, and then we send the request to the mayor's office, and then the mayor issues the proclamation. So my recommendation is to work with your local school principal or teacher to identify what is that process. And then once you identify the process, work potentially with other community groups to advocate for that to go through. And generally, the school board is the one that makes an official decision about curriculum. But again, each school district is a little bit different. And I don't have kids that go to any school, so I'm still a little bit new to learning how the local school districts here, but that would be my recommendation. And that, obviously, if anybody else has any feedback or any advice we can offer, that would be good too.
I'll make a quick suggestion. Just talk to the teachers and make it known that you have resources available. I remember as a young child, my mother would talk to the teachers and say, hey, I'm interested in hosting people to do Chinese New Year celebrations, or I'm going to do a tea ceremony. If teachers know these resources are available, they can incorporate it as part of their curriculum.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of organization, or even the three panelists today, that we all want to share our resources to all the audience who need it, and to educate the society to make it a better world, right? And that's another question I would like to direct this. I think everyone can jump in, but I wanted to start with corporate norm. As an active bystander, may I stop an attack by hitting the attacker? Would I have any protection from the law?
Yeah, definitely. Just be aware of what you're dealing with. So I wouldn't be going into the fight if he has a knife. Okay. Um, First things first, you have to protect. You're able to protect yourself before you can protect others. Because just be mindful of the recent attacks. A couple of days ago, there was an attack in New York. The two female were walking down the street. The Asian females were walking down the street, and there was a black female that was right next to them. They weren't aware of the surroundings. She grabbed a hammer and attacked them both. Just be mindful, and if you happen to be that person behind, just just be careful. You can protect others to just get them out of harm's way, but just be mindful. You can't. You're not going to be able to take fist fight to a hammer fight. Just be mindful of that situation. Just know if if you're not going to be able to help yourself, how are you going to help yourself or help others? So just be mindful of that.
So how about from legal perspective?
Well, attacking another individual, even in defense of another, is potentially a crime. Is it
Wow.
excusable? Is it justifiable? Well, that's within the discretion of the district attorney's office. And so I would really echo that what Senior Corporal Nam had said is your life is precious. And I know you're trying to save somebody else, but you need to make sure that you're in a position. Is it better for you to call 911? Is it better for you to draw attention, to create diversions? Is it absolutely necessary to put your life in jeopardy? And so those are questions that should go to in your head first, as opposed to, hey, let me be a hero.
Okay. Wow. But it's good to know that it's in the discretion of attorney. So the yeah, so it's not necessary that we're protected actually. And we also have another question. What are some of the things that Dallas PD is doing to bridge the gap and educate the Asian community?
So some of the activities we have been doing is in April we started our first Asian town hall meeting for our Asian community. So we started meeting. In our first meeting, we had about 32 concerned citizens that came out. We discussed the issues that were, that, for example, the police officers, our presence were not enough. So as a result, we started a program called a pop-up shop, where we bring our big impact mobile bus unit to a high crime area, and we go out there. We bring out our officers, we bring out our non-sworn community representative, and we go out to the community, and we just spread the seed, to spread the message that we're out here, and to promote our 21st century policing through education. So on our education side, we have our community representatives educate our citizens. On our police side, we actually do foot patrols, vehicle patrols. We go around the businesses, around the neighborhoods. We continue to go out to engage with our community members so that they feel more safe. We are doing another town hall meeting coming up, or what we call Asian Community Board meeting coming up on May 19th. If you have any questions about it, please use some of my information, send me an email, and I will send that information to you. We also have a pop-up shop that's coming up again this Wednesday at Harry Hines, 11171 Harry Hines. Please come out and interact with us. If you have any questions, we can help you, answer that question. And then on the 19th, please join us. It's anybody, any of you can come out. We're actually physically meeting. We're doing this social distancing, but we are out there. We're continuing to go out through not just the Asian district area, but throughout the city of Dallas, so that our Asian community can see us out there, more visible presence.
Thank you for Dallas PD for all those meaningful events. That helps our communities a lot. So unfortunately, we ran out of time. So I wish that we can answer all the questions from our audience, but due to the time constraints, we have to wrap it up. But before we end it, I wanted to invite all the panelists to summarize some takeaway for our audience today. So Christina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to encourage everyone to take the time to not only learn history, but also be reflective of our own biases. Growing up in the U.S., it's impossible to not have biases. That's just the way that our society is and the way that we've been educated. So be aware of your biases, and then also don't be afraid to engage with our local government, particularly the city of Dallas. We are looking forward to the next steps of our racial equity plan as we engage the community in identifying ways we can promote racial equity and also celebrate our Asian American and Pacific Islander neighbors.
Jack, do you want to get out a go?
Well, thank you, Joan. Once again, I want to thank everyone who participated today, and I'm encouraged to see so many people joining us for this conversation. And so the one thing that I want people to really remember are the people perpetrating these crimes are hoping, relying, and expecting for you not to do anything, for you to stay silent. And the more that you stay silent, the more provoked and more encouraged they are to act more aggressively next time around. Hate crime takes a variety of forms. And so for us to be able to recognize prejudice and bias in others when we feel threatened and make these reports, that is how we stand up for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Senior Corporal Nam?
Yes, and of course, going what Jack said, again, these anti-sentiment of our Asian community is not going to go away. It's going to continue to happen. So the one way we can prevent it, one way we can stop it is make sure our voices are heard. Make sure when you get that message or if you get threatened, please just make a call, police, make a report. Because if you stay silent, it's going to be same thing as you're not making a report, and it's going to keep going and going, and you don't want that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being a part of this panel and who signed up for our audience. And I also wanted to thank all the staff behind the scene that who facilitate all the program and make this a success. First of all, I wanted to thank for, I really wanted to thank like Lisa, John, Honor, who have put a lot of effort for this program and make this happen, and who stay behind the scene and just support and pour out all the resources for us. I also wanted to thank Crystal Chen and Daisy Zhou from Dallas Chinese Community Center who stay behind the scene. And Christina, do you want to thank for get the acknowledgement for your staff?
Yes, I want to say a huge thank you to Samar Iqbal and Vasavi Pila from our Asian American City of Dallas Employee Association. They helped us research resources and information that we'll be subsequently following up with you all on. We also want to thank Jessica Alvarado from the Dallas Public Library, who assisted us with publicity. And then, of course, Senior Corporal Nam and the Dallas PD for participating in the panel.
Yeah, so thank you so much for Christina, Jack, and Senior Corporal Nam. And this has been a very informative discussion. I love all the questions from our audience. I hope that everyone learned something today and get some insights. I really appreciate the time that everybody put in. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. And we will be sending out the resource page and the recorded video to you through email. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Happy Mother's Day.
Thank you. Happy Mother's Day.
Thank you. Happy. Same to you. Bye.
Thank you.
Should we stay behind a little bit?